Hello, friends. How we doing? Great to have you back with me on the podcast, or maybe you're watching on YouTube. Hello, great to see you. This is a fascinating, amazing conversation with my friend Kester Brewin, who wrote a book about AI, technology, and humanity's long arc with things like this. Yes, AI is not new. Kester argues this. And he also talks about the theology of artificial intelligence. This is a fascinating conversation that I think will blow a lot of your categories, including your category about God being embodied and church, and how AI and technology fits into all of it, as well as talking about the dangers of technology and how this stuff can actually harm a lot of people. So I loved this conversation. It really merged two passions of mine. I love theology. I love technology. Many of you know I used to work for Apple. I enjoy that whole world. I watch tech reviews all the time. I've been following the AI trend. So to have Kester on the podcast, such a brilliant individual talking about the work he's doing in this space and thinking about these things from a human flourishing perspective and also from a theological perspective is just amazing. Hey, thank you so much for being here. If you like the work that we do, please make sure to subscribe and like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or download this episode and subscribe to our podcast if you want to support the work that we do. We are a non-profit organization. We do all of this work paywall free because of the generosity of people like you. So you can donate via the link in our show notes. All donations are tax deductible. Thank you so much for supporting it. Talk to you all soon. All right, Kester Brewin, it is great to have you on the podcast. You were a recommendation from Trip Fuller, who I have come to love and adore. And as I was telling you offline, I learned very early in my friendship with Trip, there's no such thing as a 10-minute phone call with him. It's either a full 3-hour-long road trip conversation, or it's like a one-word text from me. Cool, man. See you then, right? So it's great to have you on the show.
I'm really glad you recommended, and thanks for having me on, Tim.
Well, honestly, me too, because I have a lot of questions about AI and all of what of just how fast our world is changing. I mean, really how fast it has been changing for some time. AI, I kind of hear different perspectives on. I hear some people say it's kind of overblown. I see other people say, no, this is a game changer. This is another huge leap. So we're going to get into all of that. You wrote a book, Godlike, a 500-year history of artificial intelligence in myths, machines, and monsters. The book is out now. Is that correct?
It is, yeah.
I love to hear that.
Yeah, it's a local bestseller. I will say that much. You know, it's doing well. It's doing well.
Well, I'm honestly very intrigued myself to get my hands on a copy and check it out, because I do think that we have to be having these conversations. And a lot of the audience that you're talking to grew up in a more of a fundamentalist evangelical world, so they were not really able to think about how theology and things like AI or new technologies can actually intersect and work together, or how they can help us spot blind spots, right, in both of these things. I'm kind of curious. Let's just start off here. Can you just give us a brief background of your education and just what you do now for a living? Then I'm going to start firing away all my AI questions.
Let's do it. Yeah. So I live in London. I'm speaking from Southeast London. My dad is a Church of England pastor and has been kind of in that culture, so that was the culture I was brought up in for a long time. And going back even further, I think probably my great grandfather was a famous preacher in Scotland. I think there was a 2-minute silence in Edinburgh when he died. He was like the golden voice of Scotland.
Wow.
So It's been in my blood all this time. Absolutely. The kind of liturgy was like my first poetry and my first literature and stuff. So it's been really embedded in that. But through the work that I've done in the books that I've written, I've been kind of thinking particularly about how religion and technology intersect. So I'm currently head of communications at a research charity called the Institute for the Future of Work, which is specializing in looking at how AI and automation technologies are changing the labor market. And, I'm specifically interested in how theology should be speaking into kind of economics, into social situations, all that stuff. If we only waste theological language on theology, like it's really not doing its job at all. So I'm kind of very keen about speaking how theological language, we shouldn't shy away from it. It ought to be speaking into our everyday situation.
Okay. Got it. That's helpful. I'm going to just come out of the gate swinging. Let's just start from the basics.
Yeah.
Here's the question, and I'm going to kind of qualify it. I want you to explain to me what actually is AI. And here's why I ask. First off, I used to work for Apple back in the day, not on a very technical level, but I like technology. I like keeping up with what's going on. I've tried the Vision Pro. I keep up with all the news. I know that AI is a big feature for Apple's new operating system. We got things like Chat GPT, which is fun to play around with, but also can even help me with like script writing and do other things. My uncle, who's in the financial industry, says that it can actually write pretty solid code. Then you have new products coming out like the AI Pin by Humane. We also have another one I think called Rabbit. So it seems like overnight for the average person, this term AI has just shown up everywhere. And where I'm confused about it is I understand that software essentially is lines of code. You write your code and it executes the code that you write. That's a very minimal but bare bones understanding. AI, what is the difference between that process and what AI can do? Is AI self-aware? Is it writing its own code? Break down for the audience and for me, frankly, what AI actually is and why some people are calling it this big game changer.
So it's kind of super interesting. Like the book literally opens with that question, and it
Good.
says, like AI, it's suddenly become like everything everywhere all at once. Every dinner party, and the point is, it doesn't mean anything. It means everything, and it is a completely useless term. If you say AI to anybody, really, there's no help in what they actually mean. As I say in the book, it might be someone saying AI, they might be because they're using Spotify and it's algorithmically suggesting songs. They might be using it for writing scripts. It may have been used to analyze their, kind of cancer x-ray. It may have lost them a job. It may be offering them hours for a particular shift because it's all in HR. It is so many different technologies that it's become this shorthand that means absolutely nothing and absolutely everything. And as I say in the book, it is both going to save us from the kind of horror of work, and it's also going to kill us all. I mean, like it's every single extreme.
Is this like what is it, Space Odyssey 2000? Is this like a house scenario that we're building here or something, or in Terminator, something like that, Skynet?
So it's kind of one of those interesting things that, when someone says AI, you've really got to try and think, what do they mean? And generally what people mean is ChatGPT, which is this kind of generative language version of AI, which is very, very good at writing code and very good at other things. Now, the reason why I've called the book A 500-Year History of AI is because all the books I was reading on AI were like, oh, what's the future going to be like? And my interest is like, well, whatever this technology is, at any level you want to take it at, we are making it. It is being made. It is a human creation, and therefore, everything that we are bringing to it, our desires, our history, those things are embedded within this thing we are creating. And in fact, what I do is to look back and say, you know what? This has been a technology we have desired for 500, 600, 5,000 years. It is rooted in something essential within us as humans to create this means of augmenting our intelligence and of coming up with stuff. And in fact, that's why it's a profoundly theological technology, is because not that it is doing those things of creations, but we are projecting onto it these desires we've always had about being able to do those works. So, I say 500 and I can, tell you why I go 500 in one way, but you could go back right to the beginnings of Scripture in Genesis, the tree of knowledge. And, Eve is kind of tempted to eat the apple. So many technology companies are based around fruits. It's just kind of hilarious. But, the apple, the blackberry, the raspberry, all the rest of it. But she's tempted to eat the apple. And the serpent says, eat the apple. She says, well, if I do that, I'll die. She says, no, you surely will not die. You will become like God. It is this godlike thing that somehow, if we are able to know all things, that will be a proxy for being godlike. Now, the reason I call the book A 500-Year History of AI is because back in the year 1600, there's this Italian monk called Giordano Bruno who is burnt at the stake in the middle of Rome in a beautiful piazza. You can go there. There's a statue of him there now. But he was burnt at the stake for claiming to have invented a device that would allow him to know all things. He would be able to augment his memory doing that. And that, he had an audience with the Pope and said, look, if I can do that, I will be able to become godlike, and so will you. Now, actually, that was a super tempting thing for the church authorities to think about, because actually this is a church really under threat. You've got the kind of Enlightenment stuff coming up. You've got all these kind of, different pressures from different parts of different wars, different struggles, different battles. So this ability to somehow be able to know things perfectly was so tempting. But obviously then this heretical thing, so they burn him for that. Jump forward to 1945, and if your listeners have seen the film Oppenheimer,
yes,
great film, and this is obviously, the birth of the atomic bomb. And interestingly, the name that Oppenheimer gives to that first test of the atomic bomb is Trinity, the Trinity test, which happens in 1945. And the reason he called it Trinity was actually in homage to an English poet, John Donne, who in his poem, he says, "Batter my heart, three-personed God," and goes to talk about this kind of divine act of violence, which will purify us. And Oppenheimer saw the bomb as something so violent, so powerfully destructive, that it would shock us all into world peace. As in, this kind of idea of creation and destruction, like the good and the bad, were combined together in this theological statement of like this Trinity test. Now, one of the guys who sees that test, and he's played by Matthew Modine in the film, doesn't say a lot, but he's there, is the guy who was overseeing all of US scientific efforts in World War II. And he comes out of that test and writes an article for Atlantic magazine, which is published in 1945. You can go read it now. It's amazing. And he says, look, we've spent all this time thinking about technologies of violence. We have got to invent now technologies of peace. And he theorizes a machine in that article, which he calls a memex, which is an augmentation of human intellect. And it's a way like exactly the same of Bruno's technology of back in 1600. It's a way where you can augment your human knowledge. And out of that, he says, world peace will come. Now, as a guy, 19 years old, US soldier, sitting on the beach in the Pacific, who reads that article and is like, that's what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. The war is over. And he goes home, and in 1969, he presents to a computer conference in San Francisco what's now known as the mother of all demos. And effectively, he invents the internet as, at that point, the head of the department for researching augmentation of human intellect at Stanford. All of this AI, just to give you that long background, is rooted in these very, very big questions of how can we augment our intellect, and by doing that, become more empathetic, peaceful, higher, wise, godlike beings.
Well, I actually appreciate how you speak of three examples that are all relatable to the audience, right? I mean, Adam and Eve, or the story of Genesis 2 and the fall. I actually like how you've given me a whole new way to think about it, right? Because oftentimes my only understanding I was taught was this is when sin entered the world and everyone was wicked and depraved ever since, and it's all bad. Or, this is a literal story. And it's like, well, actually, maybe the biblical author of this story is pointing to a deeper truth about the human condition that we're still wrestling with today, right? This idea of how humans are always kind of in this space of seeking more, seeking power, knowledge, in hopes of this world where there is peace, there is harmony and tranquility.
And it genuinely is right up till now. I mean,
right.
there's a great clip on YouTube with our dear beloved friend Elon Musk, who in 2015 is asked, "What do you think about AI?" Now you got to think that's like 9 years ago now.
Yeah,
quite a way away, and he really pauses and thinks about the question. Like, he goes deep in to think about it. He's at this big conference, audience member asks him the question. He says, "You know what? AI is the biggest threat we've ever had to human existence." He says, "You know what it's like? It's like the guy who summons the demon and has got the holy water and thinks it'll all work out, and it doesn't work out." Now, I don't know what he was thinking of when he talked about summoning the demon. Maybe he's talking about The Omen or The Exorcist. I start thinking about Dr. Faustus, written by Christopher Marlowe, back in hundreds of years ago, who had met the monk from Italy about his thirst for great knowledge and how he's going to create this device. And the play, Dr. Faustus, is about a bored scientist who wants to take a shortcut to knowing all things. And by doing that, will become more powerful. So he summons a demon in order to do that. And guess what? It doesn't work out particularly well. But Musk says that, and literally 3 months later drops 10 million into this new company called OpenAI. Yeah. So we've got our kind of godlike figures, these priestly figures like Steve Jobs and, as was at these great demonstrations. They are both warning of great threat on the one hand, but investing in this future very heavily on the other. And that's why, if you want to kind of talk about like theologies of empire and power and stuff, it is right there within, all of what's going on at the moment with technology too.
Man, I'm just, my brain is going in so many different directions. One observation, I just was thinking about all the stories that have formed my own mythologies and understanding. I mean, Lord of the Rings, right? The Ring of Power. Exactly. It just seems like once you have the eyes to see, you realize that so many of these key stories that we think about, whether they're in the Bible or they're Lord of the Rings or they're the stories that you just tell, are revolving around humanity's relationship to power and how knowledge gives access to that power, right? And it's just very fascinating to really think about in that sense.
Many scholars would say that the Genesis story is written during the period of exile in Babylon.
Right.
And then you've got stories like the Tower of Babel, which is perhaps linked back to the collapse of this tower that was built by Nebuchadnezzar and all the rest of it. But again, that links to a kind of empire that's able to take command of great new technologies to build these extraordinary ziggurats. And then the collapse of that is really about the scattering of language, which prevents people from sharing knowledge and building back up to reach the heavens. So this idea of language acquisition and of knowledge and sharing and building together globally, is seen as, again, this kind of building up to that point. And you can then say, well, let's look at the kind of Promethean act, in the Greek mythology about stealing fire from the gods as a proxy for language and creativity. And what's fascinating is that Promethean act has been done in reverse, as I say in the book. Like these few people have stolen language from all of us. Everything you wrote on Wikipedia, all your Facebook posts, all that stuff has been hoovered up to feed these models of language, which are going to make them very wealthy. And, we have to pay for it.
These are like learning models you're talking about, right? Essentially, in fact, I just watched, I'm sure you know MKBHD. He's a big YouTuber, tech guy. He was talking about, he was reviewing the new Rabbit AI thing, which folks don't buy. It's absolute trash right now. But one of the things that he says is that, like Elon Musk, he points to Tesla and how they had all of this data of driving data that they used to help their machine learning better understand self-driving technology, right?
Yeah.
And so it's so, in my head, technology and theology are separate. They're just separate divides, right? Like theology is ancient and mysterious and metaphysical, and technology is grounded in it, and it's a phone in my hand, and it's things like electricity and computers. But really, I love how you're bringing this together for me, because what I hear you saying is technologies have been throughout humanity, and they're actually inherently theological, because they say something about us and how we think about power and the world around us.
Let me give you an example that I've used a number of times, which I think makes the point really well. If you imagine a hammer, okay,
I could
a
do
hammer
that.
is a technology. It is a tool, and we kind of use the idea of a tool and a technology, but they're kind of one and the same thing. They are ways of amplifying our abilities. Now, I know some people who can push a nail into a wall using their bare hands. I personally cannot do that.
Same.
But with a hammer, I can. So what the hammer is doing is amplifying the strength of my arm. But it also does another thing. It reaches back through the arm into the heart and asks a question. What do you want to do with that extended power? And you can either go smash up a window or you can build a treehouse. So
Right.
all technologies both amplify, but they ask questions. And the more powerful a technology, the greater that amplification, and then the more serious the question it asks you. So if you take a gun, it's huge amplification because it's a tiny movement of the finger, action at a great distance, which can have devastating consequences. So the responsibility to use it is then much, much greater. If you take the smartphone you were talking about, that is allowing you to mediate your presence over thousands of miles. It's allowing you to send knowledge and communication in a way that to many societies would seem angelic. It is doing that work of instant messaging, but all these technologies are building, amplifying our capabilities as human beings, and they are overcoming what a 12th century theologian would say, they overcome all of the weaknesses of the fall. Like all the things that we can't do, we use technologies to be able to do. And whether that's the invention of flying machines, whether that's the invention of books, which allow knowledge to be spread over distances, whether that's the invention of telephones or emails or whatever, they're all overcoming our weaknesses. And as some would say, that is a constant shift. I mean, theologians throughout the history have talked about technologies as building us back up to that perfect place.
I'm inhaling this new connection for me that is putting things together. Oftentimes it's funny, every now and then I do this thought experiment thinking, if I could travel back in time with my iPhone 15 Pro Max that I use for my content and go to the Apostle Paul and be like, yo, check this out. Like, here's a picture, here's a video, here's how the screen works. He or someone might think like this thing is demonic, right? Like there's an unclean spirit 100%. In here, or like there's some kind of magic happening, right? And obviously today I don't think that at all. I could explain to someone the basics, right, of how this thing works. Very basic for the record. And so, yeah, like I never thought about technology in the sense of a way to amplify, right, either power in the mental space or the physical space. I mean, I think about my own platform, right? This podcast gets to the ears of thousands of people. If I make a short video on Instagram that's 10 seconds long with a caption, I did one video that reached 2 million people last year or last week. That's a big deal.
Yeah, and let me be really clear. I am technology positive. Okay,
right.
I've written a book about AI, and I've written a book that is critiquing and critical. But we all have to be technology positive because none of us can escape technology. Clothes are a technology. We're both wearing glasses. We're doing this wonderful thing where we can speak to each other from different sides of the world and we can share knowledge. That is wonderful.
But and might I add really quick, at the end of this interview, there's a feature in this program that says generate show notes. It will go through the whole thing, give me chapters, give me a description in about 35 seconds.
So all of this is wonderful and positive, but we have to be reflective and careful users of technology. Now, the Amish get a lot of bad press and like, then they're Luddites and everything. But what I love about them is you can disagree with where they drew the line, but at least they were reflective and drew a line. So, they don't use zippers, but they use buttons. They still fasten their clothes, but they're making decisions about what is appropriate for technology use. I did a podcast called the Ned Ludd Radio Hour a few weeks ago, which was kind of talking about, this guy's kind of riffing on the idea of being a Luddite and all the rest of it. And actually his point is is a good one. The Luddites were not anti-technology. They were pro-human. So what they saw was that, the mechanical looms that were coming in were going to be having a very poor effect on very, very highly skilled craftspeople. And there's a human impact of that.
Totally.
That diminished a whole skill level for an extraordinary people within a village economy so it changed things a great deal. Right. And what I'm arguing in the book is we have got to be reflective technology users because the impacts at the human scale are going to be massive. Some of them are going to be wonderful, but some of them are going to be really, really quite poor. And in the last industrial revolution, certainly in the UK, we got that very wrong. It took 100 years for trades unions and churches to respond to how people were being driven down by new progress in technology. That was a social justice issue. It was it was an economic issue. And what you see with the kind of rise of the Salvation Army and other kind of great evangelical institutions, which were dealing with problems like alcoholism, those stemmed from a radical industrialization that just trashed people. We cannot do that again. And we've got to be thoughtful as people in our communities about how we handle that.
I really agree, man. 1,000%. It is important that we reflect and think about. Okay, again, going back to the AI thing, right? It's really great that I get to hit one button and generate show notes instead of having to listen through and think about them. Or even I can even have this thing give me 5 or 6 clips for promotion that might be really good, and sometimes they really are. That's a really helpful tool.
That's great.
Right? It's great. It's great. But then I think about some of my professor friends who are like, it's a nightmare for us. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. I don't know if it's my student writing this. I don't know if it's ChatGPT. I have to fact check everything through ChatGPT. These ideas aren't their own. It might actually stifle students to think critically instead of just having it spit out an idea based on a couple random thoughts. And so I see that. One curveball question I have for you about this. One of the big problems with the Industrial Revolution, I think, is that it was also built on, like, at the time, a very sense of unfettered capitalism, right? Like just more, stuff, produce. And then we all know, like, the accumulation of capital is one of the inherent values of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Like we want to accumulate wealth. In America, at least, I'm not sure how it is in London where you're at. At least you guys have healthcare over there without having to worry about getting some kind of surprise bill in the mail. We don't have that luxury. I think about, how does capitalism in 2024 play a role in how you see AI being developed? Because we can look at how a few countries have really pillaged other places in the world for their minerals and have done them no favors, left them in shambles. And I feel like AI could really offer a lot of help to the world globally, but I'm afraid about the people who are making this stuff and their incentives. Does that make sense? What are your thoughts on that?
And you could argue that AI has been the greatest act of corporate theft in human history.
Wow.
OpenAI the other day freely admitted that they had stolen, against terms and conditions, transcripts of YouTube videos, which are obviously Google. It's a different company, and
right.
and they're like, well, what are you going to do? So, first of all, just to quickly cover how the technology works, really simply,
Please.
it's a very, very old idea. There's nothing new in the idea of AI. What we just needed was enough data and enough processing power. So all it does is just a probability model. You get it to look at a whole stack of text, and then you say, okay, I'm going to give you some text, and I want you to kind of get like a line of best fit. And this is called a back propagation algorithm, to get some more text that would fit best to that. Now, to do that, you need a lot of processing power, but to do it more accurately, you need a lot of text. So the first version of ChatGPT used, a version of Wikipedia. The models they're training on now are using like vast data sets. Problem is, where do you now get the data? Because people have realized that data itself is an asset that is valuable. So everyone's now kind of holding on to their data. But frankly, most of your data is already gone. Like, it's been ripped. It has happened.
If you're on Facebook, if you're on Google,
it's gone.
That ship has sailed a long time ago.
It is gone. And you are now being sold back, the rights to use that, basically, if you've got a paid for version of ChatGPT. The image generation stuff, you've got to train it on images. Now, that's a boring job, but also an horrific job. So, it was found that AI companies were using low paid labor in the global south, in Kenya, for example, to go through images of child abuse and tag them to train the data so that we get the nice images out the other way.
Right.
This is horrific in terms of kind of global justice stuff around that. But the wider point I want to make about technology and capital is again about this idea of amplification, but it's also about the promise that technology makes to us. And what companies tend to do, as religions have tended to do, is to make an offer or a promise to you, like, you will be saved if you do these things, or this technology will relieve you of your labor. And there's a brilliant kind of thread through scripture about, this hope of being relieved of our labor, right from Genesis right through to the garden, do you know what I mean?
Right.
And the promise of technology is going to do that. That promise tends to be false, as in, we will give you access to all this information. This is what the promise of Google is. In fact, the only way Google makes money is with us giving it information. Right. It's not that we are searching Google. Google is searching us. That's why it's free. Facebook is free is because we are feeding it data that it then sells back to us in highly targeted ads. Now, that process of kind of interconnecting us in this promise of, like, you're in this devolved, wonderful community network with all your friends. Actually, the real thing is we are going to be able to tell you everything about those friendships so that we can then design adverts to get back to you. That, I think, is very worrying, because that is about an economics of control. And that is something that is profoundly worrying for you, that when a capitalist structure, with an empire structure, when a corporation has so much information about you, it has an enormous amount of potential control over you. The key thing about AI is that it's going to lift it up to that next level. So we already see, when you go on Instagram or TikTok, and that's obviously a massive deal in terms of political capital in the US at the moment, is that your timeline is algorithmically controlled. Like, it will put certain posts up there. With AI generated content, it is going to be able to actually laser focus target created content at you that your brain is not going to be able to resist, because it's just like, it knows so much about what's going to push all your buttons. That's not going to be a positive thing, because what they want is to keep you on the app. It will be generated towards your outrage. It will be generated towards political division. That is fundamentally dangerous. We've already seen it in the UK. This was Brexit, like the Brexit campaign. That was algorithmic on Facebook. That is now illegal in the UK, but we're still suffering it.
It's bad enough as it stands with the algorithm. I mean, there was a great documentary on Netflix about this. I'm blanking on the name. It was something social media, but it had a lot of like.
I know the one. It was a good doc. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I got a thumbs up. Thank you, AI. I don't know who did that, but okay. But in that doc, they have people who worked at Instagram, Facebook saying we essentially made a very addictive slot machine model, right? Where you just kind of keep spinning to get rewarded. So it's already inherently very addictive. I mean, I have a real problem at night trying to go to bed. I'm just doom scrolling. I'm like, and I think to myself, what am I doing? Then I had this cycle: Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Twitter, Facebook, Threads, Instagram. I'm just like repeating myself. So what I hear you saying is, if you thought that was addictive and problematic, wait till AI gets in the game and actually knows even more, more precisely than ever, what to actually put in front of your screens. That to me sounds a little dystopian.
That's a mental health wave of crisis which is coming, which is really serious. There's another thing to understand about this, is that OpenAI has raised the most amount of venture capital for any company, I think, probably ever. It is going into Microsoft put 10 billion into it. They need that 10 billion back. So if you want to get into the kind of economics of value extraction, how is that going to happen? Now, for my work context, we're fortunate to have someone pretty high up in Microsoft come and do a presentation to us about their Copilot technology, which is embedded in Microsoft 365, which is an AI tool that's based on ChatGPT, and it's brilliant. Like they calculate that it will save someone who does a kind of desk-based job about 10 hours a month.
Wow.
My immediate question was, what happens to those 10 hours? Now, that's a management decision. That's a culture decision. That's an ethics and values decision. That is, okay, use those 10 hours to go and volunteer in your community. Make sure you pick the kids up from school. Go and get fitter. Go and look after an aging relative or visit a neighbor. Or we want 10 hours more work. We're going
Exactly.
to lift the intensity. These are very, very real human cultural decisions that are going to be made. And of course, if you look at where the AI products are, they are coming not just at the kind of lowest level necessarily, but for the managers. It's the algorithmic decision-making technologies. So that ability to make decision about who is working where, what shifts do they get, what do they get paid for those shifts,
Right.
it's coming for that management class. But that value extraction is really about values and culture. And that's where, ideas of church and community and how we think together about technology and what we're going to do with technologies becomes just fundamentally important.
I think this is a really important part of the conversation because my understanding, and you would know more about this than I would, is that even, the internet, computers, right? That Microsoft Word, all these technologies that we've had for so long have not really reduced the amount of hours worked, but the expectations have gone up in corporate America, right? Like, okay, now we need more from you. And we know that wages are overall have not gone up, especially when you account inflation. During
Yeah.
COVID, we know that like the top 1% of corporations and business owners made extraordinary amounts of wealth. Like, we had Amazon exploded, all those big companies exploded, while the average worker, especially the frontline workers, saw a massive dip right in their wages. So
Yeah.
in America, we still don't have our federal minimum wage is still $7.25 in 2024. And we can see that I believe that the newest stat I heard was the top 1% officially own more wealth than the bottom 60% combined. Okay. So technology so far has not leveled things out. It has not produced for at least the middle class and lower class this equitable future where, hey, you don't have to worry about your health care or your surprise bills, or you're going to have access to more to better paying jobs. So far, it seems like for a lot of people, especially in America, because that's my context, that promise has not made true.
There's a couple of things on that. So first of all, technology has got rid of some dull, dangerous, and dirty work, like coal
Yeah.
mining, for example. I would rather people were down there with robots and technical drills and and good ventilation equipment.
Yes.
Fantastic, rather than
Yes.
with a pickaxe. That's
Totally.
great. A tractor is better than a horse and plow, but the variation is very, very lumpy. And what is definitely true is that the promise that this is going to relieve you of your labor has always consistently been made. And what it's tended to do is actually to push the wealth back up to those who are controlling those technologies and can, turn them on and off at the flick of a switch, or change how they kind of interact. So the promise of your kind of influencer is, hey, set up an Instagram account and suddenly life will be easy and you'll just be kind of, whatever. But the truth of that is that you've got people just kind of working their thumbs like crazy to try and build some value in their life, as it were. That
Yes.
is the difference between the promise and the reality. And that, for me, has been an interesting parallel with the kind of the religious promises that are made and the kind of payoffs and what have you about what has been going on in that context as well. So fantastic book I can recommend, which is The Religion of Technology by David Noble. But similarly, to speak to your kind of stuff on how it's intensified, a brilliant book released in the year 2000 called Bowling Alone by an American sociologist, who made the fascinating point: there are more people than ever going 10-pin bowling in the US. There are fewer people than ever bowling in leagues with other people. And he says, well, let's just use that as a proxy for participation in community structures of any sort: church
Right.
attendance, trades unions, worker councils, community organizations. All of it has been going down. And why is that? Well, he
Right.
would place a lot of the blame on television. There are other things, and he kind of tracks this. It's a data-driven book. It's a fantastic book. He only, because it's released in 2000, he just mentions the internet at the end of that. But effectively, he's got these kind of dopamine technology of distraction, which at the end of the day, you're knackered, you've been working hard. And rather than try and criticize this structure that's done that to you, you're sat there scrolling through your phone, and you don't want to participate in the thing. You haven't got time to go to a political meeting. You haven't got time to talk to your neighbors or do whatever. You sit online and you argue with them in these kind of like, red v blue things, which is what we've got in the UK.
Have you ever heard of the term the enshittification of society?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. It might sound like a crass term to someone. It's a real term. And I watched a great video on this, and the creator, really compelling, documented how companies like Netflix, Uber, Amazon, how their business model is built upon the enshittification of their services getting more expensive for less value. And he goes through how when Netflix first launched, what it costs and what it costs now. He talked about how Amazon Prime used to cost this much. Now it costs this much, and it defaults it defaults to a slower shipping model, and you have to choose overnight shipping, or one-day shipping.
Yeah, absolutely.
Same thing for Uber. Uber's the same way. He went through a great case of how Lyft and Uber, they were selling rides so cheap, their goal was to get both the user side and the gig worker side hooked into the economy and dependent on it, and then they raised their prices, right? So maybe this is a tad bit off topic, but I think about some of those things I'm aware of now, right? Of how these systems function and what that means for AI long term,
And that's so the Uber thing is a brilliant example, particularly if you live in London, because back in the day, being a taxi driver in London in the black cabs, sure, it's the same in New York, was a highly skilled job. Like it took 2 years of training to know every street, high discretion. Someone gets in your cab, like, I want to go to Covent Garden. Okay, I know that. The Uber driver, low discretion.
Right.
The ride comes through, someone wants to go to Covent Garden. They've got 30 seconds to accept or deny that ride. And what the algorithm is doing is effectively building a kind of betting model. And it's saying, bet there is a 40% chance that this driver, who I know all this data about, will accept that ride at this lowest cost.
That's right. That's exactly right.
The person paying it is going to take that, the person, right, whatever. So they're playing people off. There's no sense of fair wages at all. But there's also no information symmetry. Now, if you want to be a hardcore capitalist, fine, but you have to have symmetry of information for a market to function. This is not a fair capitalist market because there's not fair symmetry of information in the market where the person buying and the person selling, are exchanging good information about whether that can stabilize at a fair price. Okay,
right.
So though that routinization and lower discretion of work is happening in that gig economy. One of the pieces of work that we've been doing is with an app called Rodeo, which is asking, the kind of gig riders, the Uber drivers, to log it all into one app. And that then helps them say they're doing a bit of work for Uber, say they're doing a bit of work for these other companies doing deliveries, that all their earnings are in one place. And then they can see, oh, hold on a minute. Actually, I tend to earn a bit more doing this.
Right.
But the useful thing about that is that information is then shared out to the app, who have been able to go to one of the big food companies, takeaway delivery companies over here and say, hey, we've aggregated the data. We know you dropped your wages by 10% last month.
That's right.
There's no one individual worker who can do that math. Like, they don't have the data. So this idea of gathering people together into human scale structures is actually where the book ends up. And spoiler alert, funnily enough, if you read my other work, this would be a huge surprise, but I'm basically telling people, get back to church. It is in-person communities of scale. I don't mean you have to go back to the church that, left you kind of traumatized and abused and everything. I'm saying
good qualifier, because half my audience just said, what the hell?
So I mean that as a kind of nod and a wink.
Yeah.
But what I mean is going back to communities of belonging where there is not this kind of vertical leadership, whatever, but going back to places where there is trust and transparency is going to be absolutely vital, because it's going to be the only place where you can really understand that you are known, that we can share stuff, and we know that there's a trust in the sense of doing that. It's where you will meet the other, so people not just like you. So it's not like your timeline gets algorithmized and you only kind of meet the content that and the people that have been designed for you. It's like, oh God, this is interesting. Like the old bowling league that Robert Putnam talks about in the book, where, an African-American older guy gets to meet a younger guy at the bowling league. They would never normally met. The younger guy gets cancer, and he ends up, the older guy gives his kidney to him. I mean, these are places of great exchange. They're not gathered around vertical structures of domination and power. They are gathered around. And if I can do one last bit of theology, which is, I think, fundamentally important, the reason why I'm so interested in what I would call a death of God theology is because I now feel more Christian than ever, having gone to that path whereby, through that act of crucifixion, putting to death that idea of the big other of God, this kind of transcendent upstairs being of power, means we then eat that in that moment of the Eucharist or the Mass or whatever, and we then say those incredible words. We are the body of Christ. Like, it's now distributed amongst all of us. It's only when we gather together as a bunch of people around this thing that we have destroyed that we can become that godly thing. Like, there's no one else out there to do that work of God's hands. We're going to do it because we are now the body of Christ, because we destroyed. We go through that cycle of crucifixion. And what I say to people is, look, that theology of the death of God, we have to apply that to economics. We've got to apply that to technology companies. And we've got to say, look, it's not that we say, cut it all and that's the rest of it, but we deconstruct it and share it out between us in and amongst a community where it becomes something that is generous and builds capacity amongst us in a physical community.
Wow. I just heard some Peter Rollins there, or Rollins. Do you know who he is? He wrote a book.
Okay, so we got an hour into the podcast before you mentioned Peter Rollins. That's a record.
Okay, good. Well, I will say,
I know Pete really well. I know Pete.
Okay, well, it's interesting because I read his book Insurrection. This is before January 6th, everyone. Years ago, I was reading Rob Bell, Love Wins. I discovered that book. About 30% of it made sense to me at the time, but I found it a very compelling read, and hearing you just say what you just said, that book just got flashback from my memory, and it goes, oh, that's what he was talking about. Okay, that makes sense. That's very compelling. I love what you said about community and going back to church. And I know exactly what you mean, because one of my critiques, and my board of directors knows this, my community knows this, I do not believe in digital community. Okay, I don't believe in it. I'm not saying for people who have lost everything in person that digital spaces are not helpful for them. We have an amazing Facebook community. 8,000 people are in there. They're amazing. I love hearing from them. I'm glad it's helping them. But we also have a community map where people can DM each other and hopefully meet up for coffee, because nothing beats embodiment. Nothing. I would much rather, Kester, have the money and ability to fly you out to my studio, my guest bedroom, where you and I can sit down in an actual studio and have this conversation, right? I am all about getting people to find ways to be in embodied community with each other. And here's one of the reasons why, then I'll give it back to you. You cannot hide behind the curated version of yourself that you present online, right? Now, I'm not saying that's always a bad thing, but when you're on camera, when you're texting, when you're Facebook replying, it's just a part of you. Your body language isn't considered. Who you are off the camera isn't considered. And when you're embodied with people, sometimes friction happens, and you have to learn how to work through that friction and see different perspectives. So I just had to say that. Like, I so agree with you on that point. It's so key.
I agree with you. And, to be clear, that does not mean that you are anti-technology. Let's just get over that. We are both pro-technology in that it's incredible what it can do, but we mustn't say it can do everything. And again, the promise it presents is that it can do everything, but it can't. Now, that doesn't mean we reject it and say, oh, it doesn't work. Of course, those digital connections are super helpful.
So helpful.
We have to think about that strong, complex connection that comes with embodiment. Now, there's a fascinating figure I talk about in the book called Ray Kurzweil, who you may have heard about. He made the keyboards and everything. He has got one single goal now in his life, which is he wants to upload his mind to become an online consciousness in the cloud. Okay. And he has this thing called the Moravec transfer, where each neuron will be kind of digitized and digitized. And the reason he wants to do that is because him and his acolytes would say, to quote one of them, the body is no more than a bloody mess of organic matter. And I fundamentally disagree with that, because we are, our whole bodies are sites of memory and learning. In the documentary about him and this process, which you can find on YouTube, it's called Transcendent Man. He says, people ask me, does God exist? And I say, not yet. Now, that is exactly the same thing. He is being convinced that if he can upload his mind into the cloud to become this online consciousness, he will become a version of the divine. Guess what? The Christian story is the other way around entirely. It is about coming from the cloud and becoming embodied. And that sense of embodiment is where we need to be reestablished and to get back to. I absolutely adore Pete's work, but what I hear again is that it's got to be applied to technology. It's got to be applied to the economics. It's got to be applied in those other ways. Otherwise, if we only take that kind of radical theology and apply it to theology and a bit to Hegel, we don't get to the kind of practical outworkings in a way which I do think are fundamentally important about how we go about building those communities of belonging. It's not going to be easy, partly because our brains have become slightly addicted to this flattening mediation of our presence.
Yeah,
and I've written articles that I talk about in the book about, in education, we can do everything online. No. Online learning, it's flattening us down to this experience of a piece of glass. That is not how we are as people. It makes less sense because we are using fewer senses in our body to communicate with one another. So totally with you on the embodiment, with the caveat, of course, that for so many people who've suffered trauma in that embodied space, that is not a simple thing. So it's going to require great care, great sensitivity, but we have to get to that point.
This is why what makes spiritual abuse or physical abuse at the hands of a clergy person or church leader so egregious is exactly that. My friend Dan says it's like getting injured at the hospital, right? Yeah. You expect to be at a place where you find belonging, you find community, you find acceptance, and you end up leaving the surgery room missing a leg, right? And the doctor says, it was your fault, not mine. Yeah. You're out. Yeah. And there's no way forward. Yeah. Why would you ever trust a hospital again? I totally get that. I think a lot of people, and I hear this all the time from people, whether it's DMs or emails, they are struggling to find a new sense of belonging. And everyone's in different stages of that deconstruction thing, right? Which, I was laughing earlier at the very beginning of this conversation when you said AI means everything and nothing. I was like, hey, it sounds like the word deconstruction, right? Like it's such a broad term that it can mean anything, and therefore it means nothing. But I would encourage people out there listening to start thinking about ways to find maybe a once a month embodiment with some people. It could be over crochet. It could be over basketball. It could be over talking about this stuff over a campfire. It doesn't have to necessarily be church. However, I would say that one thing I miss about being at a church, right, or that world is church gave me a sense of belonging, but also gave me a sense of purpose beyond myself. I felt like I was doing something bigger. I was a part of something that was bigger than just me, right? I was participating in an ancient tradition, thinking about how to do that here and now with people who at the time I thought we were aligned on. And then it turns out everything blew apart. Yeah. I know that there are other churches being rebirthed. There is like the post-evangelical collective, which sounds really promising. My friend Zach Lambert's doing that. And then, of course, we just discovered as of this recording, the UMC, right, makes a huge change for inclusion. So I hope that even though a lot of us have been in the valley for the past couple of years, that we get to a point for those of us who want to stay Christian to think about, well, I get I had a really terrible hospital experience, and it's valid, and I accept that, and it wasn't my fault, and this was wrong. Yes. Yeah. Maybe though there's a better doctor or a better hospital out there that maybe I could think about participating in, and maybe getting checked out again, right? That's how I think about it now. And everyone has to kind of manage that journey for themselves.
I mean, just to link this back to the kind of bigger ideas of empire and
Do
so
that.
on. I mean, the reason why I like this idea of the example we have in Christianity of this putting to death of God is because that releases us from having to then find some kind of big other structure to gather around. So, I call myself, as I say, a Christian, but I don't believe in a transcendent God at all. I believe that putting to death of that is the most Christian act, because it's now like, okay, we now take radical responsibility for loving one another, like we are the body of Christ. But what's interesting is that when you then look out to the other kind of big structures and the psychoanalyst Lacan calls it like the big other, these kind of things, these structures that are so big that there's no one person kind of in control, but they still have great effects on us. So, for example, in Stalinist USSR, it would be that, someone would say, hey, look, it's not like I want to send you to the gulag for doing that, but the party, the system says I must. So that kind of big other structure is putting pressure on people, and it dehumanizes their experience. Now, similarly, it's like, well, it's not like I mind if you're gay in the church, but, the script or so-and-so says so. So that it's actually those big structures that can dehumanize us because we act in obedience to that structure rather than with horizontally love for one another. And the same thing can happen in a kind of capitalist and a consumer capitalist environment, in that we serve that big other structure of, having to do growth, having to do that at the expense of actually investing in one another. So, if you are kind of running a business like, hey, look, the profit imperative, I've got to maximize the profits because some of the laws in the UK say that you have to. That's what your responsibility to your shareholders, not to your employees. But, getting to that perspective into the removal of the big other, as it were, where you're then committed to actually doing the most human thing for the people around you is like so important. So it needn't be that people go back to church in order to, worship again in just a different way that's a bit more casual or whatever. I'm saying, no, there's a much more radical space where you can be church without that God being as well. You can actually be like, we can be a community of sacrifice and of love for one another, and we can call ourselves Christian. We don't need the transcendent thing necessarily. That, I think, is a super interesting space. And the number of people who say, I just don't believe it anymore. I'm like, great, you can still belong. That's the fundamentally wonderful thing about it.
You just said some things that I have 1,000 more questions about that I'm gonna have to bring you back on for, because there are whole cans of worms, like the death of God and being Christian without a transcendent higher power being thing. I'm like, I comprehend that, but I have more questions. So, Kester, it was really great. I mean, this conversation, again, if you were local, I'd say come over for a beer so we could talk more about AI and how much buying from Uber Eats actually sucks and hurts everyone, including your own wallet, including the restaurant you're ordering from and the gig worker. But maybe are you coming out to beer camp in October to Trip Fuller's thing?
I am not. No,
that's
I am coming to the US on a rare visit. I try and live a reasonably low carbon life, but my cousin who lives in New Mexico is getting married in June, so I've decided to pop over at that point.
Well, what if you just stay from June through like October? Then you can come to beer camp too. Yeah, you'll keep your carbon footprint lower because you're going to plant for a few months,
exactly.
And all is said and done. All right.
No, but,
totally
I would
fair.
really love to be doing that, and it's great to be on. And thank you so much for the opportunity to chat to you and to your audience, and love to keep chatting more.
Yeah, we definitely need to. We'll have to get in their group chat or something, because I this is the stuff that makes me come alive. I love thinking about these things. I love thinking about better paths forward that also take into account the ancient wisdom of the Christian tradition, right? Of how we navigate new systems, new technologies, that while also protecting the human flourishing for all of our neighbors, right? Because what we don't want is a new system trampling over people again.
So 2 things about the book quickly. One is that it begins with an AI transparency statement where I, just stick my hand up and say, hey, where did I use AI to help writing the book?
Oh.
Which is nowhere. But, 5 years ago, I'd write a book and people would say, hey, oh God, where'd you find the time to write a book? And now they're like, where do you find the time to write a book?
Yeah, right.
There's a lot of suspicion. So I needed to come clean about it, which I think is really important and an important model for all of us. Like, okay, just say, where it's doing it. But the other thing on the very next page is, which is something I've put at the beginning of all of my books, which is the words, I might be wrong. I love writing in order to throw something out there to say, hey, look, this is not a statement of this is true and, believe it or die. But it's like, hey, I'm proposing some fire starters. And you know what? I might be wrong about this, but let's talk about it and let's have a really generative conversation about it. So that's really, I write not to reveal stuff to other people, but to try and discover stuff for myself. And then that journey of discovery goes on once, one iteration of that ideas is out there, but it doesn't mean it's the final gospel in any way. Like, no way.
Yeah. Love that. Well, friends, the book is called Godlike, a 500-year history of artificial intelligence in myths, machines, and monsters, written by Kester Brewin, which is who I'm talking to right now. Kester, it was great to have you on the podcast. We'll definitely keep in touch. We'll definitely do it again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.